Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. We are now in part 2 of the chapter, Our Tripartite Communities Today. The Middle Group, the stories of Franklin and Richard. The middle group of men, as I have defined it, includes those born between 1972 and 1988. These men are too young to have had direct experience of life in the early epidemic, but old enough that they had childhood exposure to information about it. They have experienced relatively little death and loss from AIDS personally, but many did experience significant trauma when they were exposed to the fate of gay men through media. A now middle-aged man told me a personal story. When I was about 10, which would make it around 1990, I had no idea about being gay, no conscious idea at all. I'm not even sure I knew what gay or homosexual meant exactly, though I'd heard the words. One night I walked into the living room while my parents were watching TV. On the screen, there was an image of a completely emaciated man lying in a hospital bed. And I instantly said to myself, this is my future. I don't know where that came from. It made such an impression on me that I could draw you an image of what was on the screen, where my parents were sitting, and what lights were on in the room. I remember my father looking over at my mother and saying, "That's one sorry-looking bastard." The whole thing terrified me because I knew that it was somehow about me. This kind of experience among middle group men has served consequences. They were the first gay men with no adult life or sexual experience before AIDS. For them, the gay identity seamlessly included fatal infection and disease. HIV was an integral, seemingly normal part of being gay. In the language of psychology, a syntonic element of self-experience. From the beginning of memory, AIDS characterized gay life and sex between men, and being gay was dangerous and doubly shameful. Sex was a lethal business. This early experience understandably inhibited the coming out of many middle group men. Some still have not come out, and many resisted any internal or external identification with a group that was now so clearly a multifaceted pariah in American society. When middle group men did come out, many were extremely cautious about relationships and sex, and many had anxiety-bound, truncated sexual lives. Many middle group men blamed older gay men for creating the epidemic and simultaneously resented and envied the sexual freedom that older men had before they ruined everything. Having had no sexual experience before HIV and the rise of the condom code, which dictated a condom for every instance of sex, middle group men have voiced an absolutely rigid adherence to condom use. But since 1996, middle group men have had the highest rates of new infections in gay communities. Because they were human beings, the condom, code or no code, was often forgotten or dismissed in the altered consciousness of sexual arousal. Middle group men would feel deep shame about this behavior, and they would conceal it from others. In truth, condoms suggested more than just the assurance of safety promoted by AIDS prevention educators. Condoms were also a lurking reminder of the potential lethality of sex, and a significant physical and emotional barrier between two men who were trying to connect. In the subdued light of the bedroom and the elevated intimacy of sex, condoms spoke of safety but whispered a more complex message of danger, distrust, and separation. Franklin is a 39-year-old from Nebraska, now living in San Francisco. In 1996, the first year of Heart, he had not yet come out to himself and had not had any sexual experience. Franklin's story is representative of the lives of many middle group men whom I have interviewed or worked with in therapy. I came out to myself at 29, a few years after I moved to San Francisco in 2000. I had known it but not accepted it. I can't imagine how I would have done this without the internet. I used to buy gay movies online, mostly about coming out, and they were so intense. Sometimes I'd have to stop them and continue the next day. I never got through all of them. It only took 3 or 4. I can remember exactly where I was standing in my apartment, and I said out loud to myself, "I am gay." This was in 2002, and it was the first time I said that. As a teenager, I never had sex. I was too afraid. But I had a girlfriend who kept asking me why I looked at guys, and I said I was interested in what they were wearing. Right before coming out, I had sex with a girl. Not very successfully. No erection. Because of the internet, I could connect with gay men, and it was a year after I came out that I first did something with a guy. He was a guy who liked to find guys who weren't experienced and have sex with them once, and you'd never see him again. I'd always been inclined to relationships, but this experience was very intense and wonderful. I was sort of glowing the entire next day. Then I met another guy, and he was my boyfriend for 2 years. It was a way to dial down the intensity and also to learn the ropes. I certainly didn't know anything about heart in '96. Heart didn't change anything for me. Even after I came out, I didn't know anyone who was sick. Or maybe I would hear socially that a person was positive, but I didn't personally know any of them, except my family's priest, who died of it when I was 10. He had a wife and kids, and they suddenly moved away, and my mother talked about his having AIDS. And I had read a lot, and the press was full of it from the time I was a kid. It was in the newspapers and television news, protests against Reagan administration, and the things like that. It was a big deterrent to my coming out, even though now gay doesn't equal HIV, it's just a part. Before, when I was a kid, the only coverage about gay people was about AIDS. Except for things like Elton John on MTV, it was all about AIDS. My family went to church on the weekends, an Episcopalian thing, and I was aware that a lot of Christian people didn't look favorably on gay people. It was a bad thing. And AIDS was a bad thing, and I suppose this all got mixed up together. So I thought Elton John was a bad thing, and I was trying to reconcile his being a decent person with his doing this bad thing. I knew that this all somehow related to me, though I wasn't quite sure how, and I thought it was a phase I could grow out of. That was the fantasy I told myself. I thought of being gay as being sick and being an outcast. When I did first come out, I thought I knew how HIV was transmitted, and I was very aware of not wanting it. I had no interest in penetrative sex because of that, at least not initially. I'd never been kissed. I'd never even kissed a guy, so penetrative sex would have been a big leap. In that first 2-year relationship I had, we started having intercourse, and I was always insistent on condoms. I didn't have intercourse without a condom until my current boyfriend in 2012 or so. It was unthinkable before that, and no matter how small the possibility, there was a possibility. I'd seek out people online who were like me, who were worried about HIV. I had great anxiety about it. It was a third rail, a place you wouldn't go. As a result, I didn't have much sex. Online, if a guy said he had HIV, they put it in their descriptions like a hair color or height. I would drop them if it was about dating or hooking up. It scared me too much. You hear now, in 2014, about young men in their 20s and 30s feeling impervious, that they won't get it. But that was something people my age never felt. For me, normal sex meant condoms or not having intercourse. For intercourse, for sure I used a condom. Not using it was never an option. When I first did a few years ago, I had a lot of anxiety. It was my partner's request. It was like driving without a seatbelt, which I would never do, like I was doing something wrong. For my partner, it's an intimacy thing, being closer but not using condoms, and I've heard that a lot. I'm mostly assertive, and any benefit I get from not using one is offset by the risk, and I get anxious. It was Magic Johnson who made me think that as a top, you were quite at risk, because he said he had a lot of sex with a lot of women. And I don't know if that's true, but that's what a lot of us took to be true. Everything was condoms. I had read a lot about it over the years. When I first came out to my mother when I was 28, the very first thing she said was, "Do you have safe sex?" I know why she asked that, because it's the first thing that would go through your mind about being gay. She asked me if I wanted her to tell my father, and I said yes. He had never to this day said anything to me, and I've never asked him how he feels about my being gay. I'm not close to him, and as a kid I hated him. He was verbally abusive, and it wasn't a loving household. I never thought he was proud of me. He doesn't like difficult conversations. I feel quite certain that the epidemic changed my life. Much of the effect was subtle and tangential. Without a doubt, it helped create my identity as a gay man and what it means to be gay, because HIV and being gay were highly associated in the world and in my mind all the way from childhood. Thoughts like that go on and on. I feel sheepish saying all this because it's nothing compared to the impact it had on people who lived in San Francisco or anywhere earlier on and had friends die. I know my life is nothing in comparison. I know that some people now think of HIV as a chronic manageable disease, but I think of it as instant death. I still think of death. I think of not using condoms as playing Russian roulette. Franklin was meticulous about avoiding HIV, but he voiced a nearly universal feeling among men in this age group. He never felt reasonably confident that he could have a gay life without contracting HIV, and this doubt has stayed with him. Anxiety learned in childhood is not easily surmounted and often shadows us for the remainder of our lives. Franklin took one of the 2 courses available to men confronted by such fear. He limited his sexual life. He adhered zealously to the use of condoms until recently, and he avoided men he knew or conjectured were HIV positive. The result has been that he remained uninfected, but he has, in his own description, paid some significant emotional costs. He has experienced less connection to others, less intimacy, less pleasure in sex, and less freedom and spontaneity than he would have liked. His life has been constricted by diligence. Another course Franklin might have taken, but did not, was that taken by Richard, a 34-year-old who came to see me in 2010 because he had recently tested positive for HIV. Long before he actually contracted it, he had substantially abandoned hope of not contracting it because having HIV felt inextricably bound to being gay. Risky sex was what gay men did, and Richard had known that fact from the age of 12. Among middle group men, his abandonment of hope is expressed in relatively high rates of potential exposure, low rates of HIV testing, and the highest rates of new infections. The hopelessness is either consciously accepted and acted out, or repressed and denied and acted out less consciously, often impulsively. When repressed and denied, at least one of 2 related psychological actions is probably operative: breakthrough or counterphobic processes. The 2 may result in similar behavior, and both may be facilitated by the use of disinhibiting substances that are also used to self-medicate mood and anxiety. Alcohol, along with methamphetamine and other stimulants, is commonly used to allow oneself to act out breakthrough or counterphobic behavior. The substances rarely cause the behavior, they usually facilitate it. The purposeful psychological process behind the behavior is the primary motivator. Constrained and frightened men do not have sex because they drink. They drink to facilitate sex, whether they are conscious of the true casual relationship or not. If a man asserts that he did something because he was drunk, the obvious question is, why did he get drunk? Breakthrough behavior is the sporadic, impulsive release of emotional tension through the acting out of normally forbidden or self-forbidden behavior. Brittling under external or internal constraints, we suddenly release pent-up feelings and the behavioral impulse has broken through. A life characterized by breakthrough behavior is tensely strung between unreasonable or impossible constraint on one end and impulsive, sometimes destructive release on the other. Both ends of this polarized life are potentially destructive, but there is a more constructive middle ground: to think through the validity of our constraint and make decisions to take responsible risks for things we value. The exploration of that middle ground requires conscious consideration of both the constraints and the benefits. Initially, Richard described a relatively simple breakthrough experience to me, but with suggestions that something more was going on. I don't really know what happened because I'm normally very cautious. I know about HIV, I have forever, and it's not been a big deal in my life, but I sure didn't want to get it. But every now and then, I felt like I couldn't stand it, and I'd find someone on Grindr, go to his place, and fuck my brains out. The night I got infected, I don't know, I was a bit drunk, but not really drunk. I was lonely, exhausted, and tired of it all. And tired of all of it. All of what? I asked. The tiptoeing around, all the tension. Every once in a while, I just had to get out. I really regret this one night, but I don't know if I could have done it differently. I was just at a point where I couldn't go on the way I'd been living. As Richard and I worked together for over 5 months, it became clear that he had spent a childhood and adolescence tiptoeing around in fear, including fear about being gay and about HIV. His current breakthrough behavior was very much modeled on how he lived during that time, as an intimidated, frightened, occasionally acting out adolescent. Both of his parents had grown up in Midwestern farming families, and the puritanical Midwestern ethos was very much a part of Richard's childhood. The primary thing with my dad was to never have feelings about anything, especially because I was a boy. It was the "don't be a sissy" warning. My mom, Richard stopped. Your mom what? I was going to say that she did whatever he told her to do, and she expected me to do that too. Once I turned on the light in the living room, and she said, "Oh, don't do that. You know it's going to upset your father. Don't upset your father." And I turned it off. So it sounds like you really had no support from anyone to have your own life or to be yourself. Definitely not. My mom was very frightened of him, and she made me more frightened of him. If you didn't do exactly what he wanted, my dad's favorite thing to say to me was, "Can't you think about anyone but yourself?" It was a way to make me feel ashamed of being selfish, and I did. I felt ashamed for wanting anything. Did you have friends or perhaps relatives, aunts or uncles who were supportive? No one. My grandfather lived with us, and he was senile. He hardly ever talked. He just drooled food on himself, and it was one of my jobs to clean him up. My mom would try to relate to me, but it was always for her. It was always like she was taking something from me and not giving me anything back. She had no one either. She was married to my father, and her father was just drooling. Right now I'm imagining that you experienced a lot of loneliness, and I'm wondering about your adolescence and about dealing with feelings in general, and feelings about being gay, which would certainly have been something for yourself. I was buried in sci-fi books. I spent most of my time at home when my dad wasn't making me do something, just lying on my bed reading. And your social life? Your emotional life? I didn't know what those things were. I couldn't tell anyone I was gay. I didn't want to be gay. I didn't want to be sick. Sick? Sick like a faggot. And sick, you know, with AIDS, which I knew about. Sick for being selfish. When I told my parents on the phone 4 years ago that I was gay, my father said, "You've driven a stake through your mother's heart. Can't you ever think about anyone but yourself?" And I haven't talked to them since. I know that your family was giving you very little, but I imagine that you must also feel some loneliness from the break with them. And I'll tell you what I started doing when I was maybe 15 or so, which I've never told anyone. I would ride my bike to a truck shop on Route 70 near our house and go into the parking area for the big rigs and find a trucker I liked and tell him I'd suck him off or ask him to fuck me. And most of them agreed, almost all of them. They had those double caps with beds in the back, and we'd do one or the other, and then I'd leave. I did that at least 50 times, maybe 100. This sounds like what you were doing when you contracted HIV. I imagined that your completely constrained life, your loneliness, and your need for companionship had become unbearable. You needed to do something about it. I did, in the only way I knew how. In going to the truck shop, were you not fearful about HIV, which you just said you knew all about as a kid? I was afraid, but what? But I didn't want to be afraid. I couldn't stand it anymore. I was afraid of everything, and it was squeezing me to death. I had to try to get out of it. Richard, that is what you said to me in slightly different words about the night you got HIV. You were doing two things as a teenager, and you're still working on them. You were trying to break out of the isolation constraints you lived with, and you were trying to confront the things you feared, including being gay, disappointing your parents, and HIV. There are ways to deal with these problems more thoughtfully, I should say, more consciously. And that's what we need to try to talk about. Your life now need not be written by your parents and your fear of them. You need to write your own life now. Compared to the breakthrough process, the counterphobic process is a somewhat more complexly motivated adaptive strategy, but not unrelated. Counterphobia might be described as a fear-centric iteration of a breakthrough process. We break, though not simply to relieve tension and obtain the things we need, but to engage in the behavior we most fear. Through exposure and practice, we hope to learn to either repress and tolerate the fear, or, even better, to master the situation and make it less fearful. The pervasive fear that Richard had lived with since childhood suggested not only breakthrough behavior, but also some elements of counterphobic behavior. Even in his first rendition of what had happened the night he contracted HIV, Richard suggested some counterphobic elements by describing himself as normally very cautious and tiptoeing around. In my experience, some of the most cautious men, including many working in AIDS prevention, are among the most fearful and the most likely to sporadically take high HIV risks. When Richard first came to see me, he was not fully conscious of the amount of fear he felt about sex and HIV, in part because it was entangled with other long-standing fears. He first said, "HIV has not been a big deal in my life," but later on he talked about his father and about not wanting to be sick. As we talked over the months, Richard became much more conscious of his fear. If breakthrough processes are about sporadically and impulsively breaking out of imposed or self-imposed constraints, counterphobic processes are about confronting fear in the hope of resolving it. Counterphobic behavior is not just about blowing off steam, nor is it simple thrill-seeking, and counterphobic behavior is often more consistent, less sporadic and impulsive than simple breakthrough behavior. Breakthrough behavior without an underlying counterphobic component is seen in men of all ages, particularly highly libidinal young men, who quite naturally respond sporadically to any excessive sexual constraint they live with because of apprehensions about HIV. Fear and apprehension, both of which we often repress into unconsciousness for obvious reasons, are usually more constructively addressed when we allow ourselves to consciously consider them. Like shame, unconscious, and thus unconsidered, fear and apprehension are much more likely to play themselves out harmfully. The younger group, the story of Jason. I have defined our younger group men as those born in 1988 or later. In 2018, mostly in their 20s, they're finding gay communities just entering adulthood and trying to plan for and make sense of adult lives. This is a daunting time in life, and the denial of inexperience, uncertainty, and vulnerability is probably the primary adaptive tool that young men bring to the task. Without denial, becoming an adult would otherwise often feel impossible, and all the more so when one is gay. This developmental adaptation is one important source of the common observation that young people act as if they were invulnerable. And the same observation has often been made about younger group men's handling of HIV. In the pursuit of clarifying self-experience and finding self-acceptance, Younger group men have three potential advantages over older men. First, some of these men have had the benefit of greater acceptance from families and local communities. Second, unlike middle group men, younger group men did not experience a traumatic childhood in which the death sentence of HIV became inextricably bound up in a gay identity. Third, like middle group men, younger group men did not suffer the direct loss and trauma of living through the early epidemic. If younger group men have seen an older man bearing the medical consequences of long-term HIV infection, they often do not distinguish it from old age. The vast majority of younger group men have no experience of HIV-related deaths. Only about 8% of men between the ages of 18 and 44 have known someone who died of AIDS. Over the age of 35, that figure jumps sixfold to 47%. Unlike middle group men, who experience HIV as symptomatic, as a familiar component of being gay, younger group men experience HIV as dystonic, unexpected and foreign to their lives. Because it is dystonic, young men typically shun HIV, and men under the age of 35 are much more likely than middle and older group men to express discomfort about relationships or sex with someone who is HIV positive. 79% of young men are very or somewhat uncomfortable with a long-term sexual relationship with an HIV-positive man. 89% feel similarly about casual sex with such a man. What about a non-sexual friendship with a positive man? Fully 40% in this group describe themselves as very or somewhat uncomfortable with that possibility. Younger men are, consciously, both unfamiliar with HIV and, by self-report, highly avoidant of it. In contrast to this stated avoidance of HIV, 58% of HIV-negative younger group men also reported unprotected anal intercourse in the 12 months prior to a CDC survey. HIV testing levels are also low in this group, and, as a result, so is proper early treatment of infection. The CDC reports that 29% of otherwise healthy 25 to 29-year-olds progress from first diagnosis of HIV infection to clinical AIDS within 12 months. The contrast between young men's stated avoidance of HIV and their behavior is not perplexing, precisely because they experience HIV as dystonic. Precisely because they experience HIV as dystonic. As foreign to their lives, young men give it relatively little thought. When a man is emotionally or sexually attracted to another man, he experiences the other man symptonically, as non-alien and like himself. The assumption, what else could it be on first meeting, of a symptotic experience is one of the important elements of initial attraction. For an HIV-negative man, this would suggest that the other man is also HIV negative. The same often occurs for positive men, who make an assumption that another is positive. In the early stages of romance, we often describe one man's experience of another as blinded by love. We perceive another as we want him to be in new romances and in novel, one-off sexual encounters. The symptotic assumption has been a problem in HIV prevention for men of all ages since the beginning of the epidemic, and it is all the more powerful and obfuscating for a generation that has never identified with HIV and has never seen someone apparently healthy one day and dead 2 days later. Bewildered and angry older gay men readily stigmatize younger men for their handling of sex and HIV. But it is simplistic and unproductive to take the above-cited statistics and issues and attribute them to nothing more than carelessness, ignorance, stupidity, or prejudice. Younger group men grew up in a society that declared in 1996 that the epidemic was over, when the oldest men in the group were 80 years of age. When these men entered gay life, they found themselves in communities preoccupied with gays in the military and marriage equality, with HIV a fringe issue relegated to a small back burner. If young men have been inattentive or in denial about HIV, there is little doubt about why, historically, these young men were handed a very different relationship to HIV than older men had, and there's little reason to expect them to experience HIV as older men do. For younger men, HIV is not part and parcel of being gay, and not something they expect to be part of their lives. In addition to allowing for their different historical relationship to HIV, we must also remind ourselves that younger group men are appropriately characterized by youth. They live with the difficulty of finding meaningful adult lives and the challenging discovery of irrational human sexuality in relationships, and they navigate all of this with a characteristic developmentally adaptive denial of vulnerability. Younger group men deserve much more than dismissive ridiculing of their behavior. We live now with HIV endemic in America's gay communities, and young men deserve attention, support, and mentoring from comprehending communities that actively demonstrate concern for their health and well-being. Jason grew up in Arizona and attended the University of Arizona at Tucson, receiving a BA in philosophy. After graduating in 2011, Jason, a handsome African American, moved to San Francisco, having decided that he wanted to live in a large gay community and that he wanted to be a chef and someday have his own restaurant. When I interviewed him in 2014, he was 27 and a full-time student at Le Cordon Bleu College of Culinary Arts in San Francisco. His parents were helping him with part of his tuition and living expenses, and he was also working part-time as a sous chef for a San Francisco restaurant. Jason was HIV negative. I moved here for the culinary school because I wanted to finally be part of a gay community, which I never really had in Arizona. My family paid for my college expenses and was very supportive of my being gay, which is unusual for a black family. Other black families I've known treat their gay kids like Uncle Tom, like they violated the solidarity of African Americans because being gay is a white thing. I think that's crap, and my parents don't go for it either. While in my senior year of high school, I came out to them at dinner with great trepidation, and my mother said, "Jason, eat your zucchini. Your father and I have known this for several years, and we want you to be happy. We love you." My father said, "Ditto what your mother said," and then we pretty much went on with dinner. I was flabbergasted. Later, my mother talked to me about dating and sex, and things like that, which was very embarrassing. But family isn't enough, and I knew that in San Francisco there were thousands of gay men I could meet. And because I knew San Francisco was very liberal, I didn't think being black would be a deal. Arizona is provincial, and there's a lot of sexism and racism if you just walk off campus. As it turns out, I've been very lonely here. It's not the panacea I thought it would be, on any score. There is no community. It's just a lot of gay men crammed into a small town. Smaller than I thought, and everyone's out doing his own thing. You can go to bars, but it's a big dick hunt, and half the people are drunk or high. Most people hook up online, and if you stand on the corner of Castro and 18th and look on Grindr, there are 300 guys within 50 feet of you, all looking for hookups. That can be fun, and I sometimes do it, but it's not a life. After being here for 3 years, I've had a hard time making real friends. I have 2 guys I hang out with a lot when I have free time, and we're pretty tight, but they're not what I call good friends. One of them, Noah, is positive, and he's only a year older than I am, and that's a deal in itself. What the 3 of us share is this sense of not having a community, but somehow we're not one either. None of us much uses drugs, and of the 3 of us, I'm the only one who hooks up pretty regularly. There are 2 big things I really didn't count on about the so-called community here. The first is that being black, you're a commodity, and people are either into your commodity or they're not. In school, I was more just another gay guy because there weren't that many gay guys to choose from. Here, there's no in between, and practically nothing else matters, and I don't like that. I resent it. You look on Grindr and the guy says, "Looking for black dude, 20 to 30, DDF, UB2. So that leads me to the second thing, which is HIV. It's always been around, so it's no big deal like it was for you older guys. When I was in school in Arizona, no one ever said a word about AIDS. I never heard a single person mention it, and I've never used a condom for fucking. I've never met someone who did. Here, it hardly ever comes up. Almost never, except in the DDF kind of way, or someone will ask if you're clean. Some guys use condoms, but it's the minority in my experience here, just every now and then. And you can never tell who's telling the truth. I also think there's a kind of, well, it's almost a racial thing, is that HIV is something normal people don't get. Well, I'm not in the normal group as far as a lot of white guys are concerned, and I think maybe I get questioned more than a white guy would. You get the feeling that white guys don't think white guys, normal people, get infected. I started talking about Noah, who's white. He's in pretty bad shape, really. I don't mean physically, because when you get HIV, that's pretty much the end of your social life, especially sex. Guys that we both know, I'll be someplace with Noah, and they act like he isn't there. They completely ignore him and talk to me. It's embarrassing, and I feel bad for him. I'd bet that he hasn't had sex since he got it. I see this all the time when I'm out with him, and it pisses me off. It's made me a lot more worried about getting it because I don't want a life like that. Once, when I asked him about people ignoring him, he said, "It's like turning 40. No one's interested in you." People are sometimes really hostile to him, say things to him directly, and tell him he was stupid and got what he deserved, and that kind of thing, and you know they're doing the same thing he used to. He closed his Grindr account because when he would tell people he was positive, he'd get all kinds of crap. It's that racist thing, and I think a lot of these guys think they wouldn't be interested in anyone who was the type who would get HIV, and therefore they won't get it. I used to have sex with much older guys, in their 40s or so, but I've stopped because I knew a lot of them have HIV, and I don't trust them, to be honest. I think getting HIV is probably the worst thing that could happen to me. I'm not worried about getting sick because I know that doesn't happen anymore. But I'd definitely never have a boyfriend for the rest of my life. Jason's experience in the gay mecca of San Francisco does not suggest that all is well in gay communities, or that individual gay lives in America have been suddenly transformed by a small handful of recent, and with Donald Trump as president, potentially tenuous political and judicial victories. In my conversation with him, Jason raised at least 3 distinct issues of concern: the ongoing late epidemic on how young men experience and handle it, the social incoherence of gay communities, and the role technology plays in that problem, and the stigmatization that young men sometimes direct at one another. I have heard expressions of similar feelings from many young men. For older gay men with direct, personal experience of the early epidemic, the lack of young men's concern for the medical consequences of HIV often seemed inexplicable. But for a majority of younger men, HIV concerns are more about potential stigma than medical issues. Stigma alone can make contracting HIV a life-changing trauma for a young gay man who is suddenly ostracized from a community in which he had sought companionship and refuge from a still stigmatizing larger society. Young men's relative lack of concern with medical issues is understandable. They have grown up in a highly pharmaceuticalized culture in which people routinely use prescription medications for chronic, manageable medical issues. And it is true that if diagnosed and treated early enough, HIV infection hardly resembles what older men once lived through. The San Francisco physician Gary Feldman put HIV in a contemporary context. With the meds we have now, HIV is in some ways easier than diabetes. Checking your blood sugar and controlling your diet is harder. Guys with HIV who have never been sick, they take a pill when they brush their teeth and they're done and they get on with their lives. That person puts very little effort into their day compared to someone with diabetes. HIV infection today is not, however, without its medical consequences and expense, whether young men are aware of them or not. But the consequences are not the ones so many older men have seen and personally experienced. We cannot expect younger men to have the perspective of older men, or to behave as older men feel when they ought to. Young men are naturally sexual, and today young gay men often have very active sexual lives that echo those of the gay liberation years. Any intervention aimed at ameliorating the consequences of the late epidemic must be built on an acceptance of that fact. Several influences are behind the second issue that Jason raises: social incoherence in gay communities and its consequential isolation and loneliness for gay men. As discussed in Chapter 1, gay communities today are fundamentally incoherent, significantly divided between the championing of diversity and the push for assimilation into the larger society. Young men generally have little say in the matter. Gay politics and community organizing are generally conducted by middle-aged and older men with their own needs in mind, and the young are left to follow the fence for themselves. In many men, we witness the fruit of the typical gay adolescent experience, which does not support authentic, gay socialization. It usually obstructs or prohibits it, and the consequences are readily evident in later life. I will more fully discuss the problem of isolation, its early life developmental roots, and its exacerbation by contemporary technology in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Jason's third issue, the stigmatizing treatment that young gay men often direct at one another, is the consequence of many influences, including early life experience, unvoiced apprehension about the late epidemic, and social incoherence. Such treatment of others has significant roots in a craving for acceptance of oneself, a need that is, for obvious reasons, often a part of gay lives. Feeling unacceptable, we reject others who appear unacceptable, in hopes of thus turning the tables and vindicating ourselves. Young people must be understood as young people. They are attempting to discover themselves, and erratic trajectories and unresolved lives are a natural part of that exploration. The young learn largely from their own experience, rather than from the often questionable wisdom of elders. In working with young men in therapy, I see how they go about building adult lives. Each man does it as if it had never before been done. My most useful role is not to inform them with solutions, but to help them with self-discovery. For young men, discovery is the game, be it an exploration of the solar system or another man's body, both of which are paths to discovery of the world and oneself. When we were young, we rightly assemble the materials to build a bridge to the moon. When we get older, we often use those materials to build a shack, which is a questionable kind of progress. The old among us must allow the young to be young. They will be, anyways.